Millionaire marries black woman with 5 kids. The reason behind his choice leaves everyone curious. In this eye-opening video, we delve into the incredible story of a millionaire who made a life-changing decision that defied societal norms and expectations. This man, accustomed to a life of luxury and privilege, chose to marry a remarkable black woman who had 5 kids. At first, many people couldn't comprehend his choice, and they ridiculed him for it.
Ethan Westwood was not the kind of man anyone expected to be in the headlines for his love life. A self-made millionaire with a reputation for sharp business instincts and a golden heart, his life revolved around boardroom negotiations and high-profile charity events. Yet when he announced his engagement to Naomi Johnson, the news spread like wildfire. Not because of admiration, but because of disbelief. Naomi was a single mother of 5, a woman who had spent years juggling multiple jobs to provide for her children. Her days were a far cry from the glamorous lives of Ethan's previous partners. She volunteered at a local community center, pouring her energy into helping families who struggled, much like she once had. It was here that Ethan first saw her. It wasn't a grand meeting. Ethan had visited the center to oversee the progress of a new children's library he had funded. He remembered standing off to the side, listening to the chatter of kids and the occasional scolding of adults trying to keep things in order. Naomi stood out immediately, not because she was the loudest or the flashiest, but because of the way she interacted with the children. Her laughter was contagious, her patience unending, and her warmth undeniable. When their paths crossed, it wasn't love at first sight, it was curiosity. Ethan had struck up a conversation with her, trying to understand what motivated someone to work so tirelessly for others without expecting anything in return. Naomi, ever modest, had brushed off his questions, redirecting the spotlight to the kids and the work that needed to be done. She had no idea who he was at first, treating him like just another visitor. That first meeting turned into several others. Ethan found himself stopping by the center more often than necessary, drawn to Naomi's unassuming charm. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, nor did she fawn over his achievements. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, not as the millionaire entrepreneur, but as a person. Naomi's world was chaotic and grounded, filled with scraped knees, overdue bills, and simple joys. It was a stark contrast to his, but it made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. Their relationship blossomed quietly, away from the public eye. Naomi was hesitant at first, wary of letting anyone into her life who might not understand the responsibility of raising 5 kids. But Ethan was patient, persistent in his gentle way. He spent time with her family, helping with homework, attending Little League games, and getting to know the kids on their terms. Over months, what had started as admiration grew into something deeper, a bond rooted in respect, kindness, and shared values. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't with an extravagant public display or a flashy diamond ring. He had taken Naomi on a simple walk through the park near her house, one of the few places where she felt at ease. As they stopped by a bench, watching her youngest child chase after a ball, he turned to her, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "Naomi, I don't have the words to describe how much you've changed my life. I've seen the love and strength you pour into everything, and I want to spend my life earning the right to stand beside you. Will you marry me?" Naomi's heart raced. She hadn't expected this. Not from Ethan, not from anyone. Her eyes welled with tears as she looked at the man who had seamlessly woven himself into her world. Her children, who had been skeptical of him at first, now adored him. Ethan wasn't just proposing to her. He was proposing to her entire family. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes, I will." The announcement of their engagement was supposed to be a joyous moment, but it was met with scorn and disbelief from Ethan's world. Friends questioned his sanity, while tabloids pounced on the story, spinning tales of a millionaire being trapped by a single mother. Social media exploded with comments, many cruel, mocking their relationship as a mismatch. Ethan didn't care about the noise. He knew what he had in Naomi, a partner, an equal, someone who brought light to his life in ways he hadn't thought possible. But Naomi struggled to ignore the whispers, the stares, and the judgmental glances. She had expected some backlash, but the harshness of it all left her reeling. In private moments, she questioned whether she had made a mistake in saying yes. Ethan's world was far from hers, and the weight of public scrutiny felt like an impossible burden. But when she looked into Ethan's eyes, saw the sincerity and determination in his every action, she knew one thing for certain. Their love was real, and it was worth fighting for. The announcement of Ethan and Naomi's engagement sent shockwaves through both their worlds. For Ethan, the pushback came swiftly and sharply. His inner circle, the polished, high-powered executives and old-money elites he often rubbed shoulders with, couldn't hide their disdain. The whispers were loud enough to reach his ears, and even the boldest among them didn't hesitate to say it outright. "She's not your type, Ethan," his college friend Marcus remarked one evening over dinner. "She has 5 kids, man. 5. Do you even know what you're getting yourself into?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm in love with her," he replied simply, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of a drawn-out argument. But the remark lingered, stinging more than he cared to admit. For Naomi, the judgment was even harsher. She wasn't used to the kind of attention that came with being linked to someone like Ethan. Suddenly, her every action was under scrutiny. Women at the community center whispered behind her back. Once kind neighbors now looked at her with suspicion, some even outright accusing her of using Ethan for his money. "I heard she snagged a millionaire," an older woman in the grocery store muttered loudly enough for Naomi to hear. "She must have some kind of trick up her sleeve. Women like her don't just get men like him." Naomi turned away, biting her lip to stop the tears that threatened to spill. She refused to let anyone see her break, especially in public. She had dealt with judgment her whole life, from being a young widow to struggling as a single mother. But this felt different. The weight of the cruelty was suffocating, and no matter how hard she tried to rise above it, it clung to her like a shadow. Her children weren't spared either. At school, her eldest, Jamal, bore the brunt of the teasing. "So, your mom's a gold digger now, huh?" One boy jeered during lunch. Jamal clenched his fists, the anger bubbling just beneath his skin. "Shut up," he growled, his voice low but menacing. When the boy laughed and pushed him further, Jamal snapped, shoving him against a locker. The principal called Naomi in that same afternoon. As she sat across the desk, listening to the principal recount the fight, Naomi felt a wave of guilt crash over her. She had worked so hard to protect her children from life's hardships, and now her choices were bringing them even more pain. That night, she held Jamal close, stroking his hair as he admitted through angry tears that he didn't trust Ethan. "I don't want to lose you, Mom," he whispered. "What if he's like everyone else? What if he leaves?" Naomi's heart broke, but she couldn't blame him. Trust didn't come easy, not for a family that had been through so much loss. Meanwhile, the tabloids were relentless. Photos of Naomi in simple jeans and sneakers, picking up her kids from school, were splashed across gossip websites. From rags to riches, how this single mom snagged a millionaire, one headline read. Social media was worse. Complete strangers picked apart her life, her looks, even her children. Ethan did his best to shield her from the negativity, but he wasn't immune to the pressure either. His mother, Gloria Westwood, called him in for a talk one evening. Over tea in her sprawling mansion, she didn't mince words. "Ethan, you're making a mistake," she said, her tone clipped. "This woman is not suitable for our family. She's bringing baggage, a lot of it." Ethan set his cup down, his patience already wearing thin. "She's not baggage, Mom. She's the woman I love." Gloria's lips pursed, her disapproval evident. "You've worked too hard to let emotions ruin everything you've built. Think of the optics. Think of your legacy." "My legacy is what I build with Naomi," Ethan shot back, his voice firmer than he'd intended. "And if you can't support that, then maybe you don't know me as well as you think." The conversation ended in cold silence, with Gloria glaring at her sons retreating back. Ethan knew standing up to his family would be difficult, but he hadn't expected the loneliness that came with it. For Naomi, the loneliness felt even more profound. She found herself pulling back from people she once trusted, wary of their judgment or pity. The love she shared with Ethan felt like a beacon of hope in her darkest moments, but even that light couldn't entirely banish the doubts creeping into her mind. Late one night, as the kids slept, and the world outside was quiet. Naomi sat on her couch, scrolling through the comments on an article about their engagement. Most were cruel accusations, insults, and harsh words from people who didn't know her. Her chest tightened as she set her phone down, tears slipping down her cheeks. When Ethan called that night, she hesitated to answer, not wanting him to hear the crack in her voice. But the sound of his steady, reassuring tone was exactly what she needed. "Hey," he said softly. "How are you holding up?" Naomi took a shaky breath. "It's hard, Ethan. It's harder than I thought it would be." "I know," he replied. "But we're in this together, Naomi. I don't care what anyone says. I chose you, and I'll keep choosing you every day." In that moment, Naomi realized that despite the storm raging around them, she wasn't alone. And as long as Ethan was by her side, she'd find the strength to weather it. Ethan knew that introducing Naomi to his family was going to be a challenge, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep their resistance would go. His mother, Gloria Westwood, had always been a commanding presence in his life, a woman whose sharp wit and unyielding expectations shaped him into the man he had become. His father, Robert, was quieter but no less imposing, with a measured way of expressing his opinions that often carried even more weight than Gloria's directness. Together, they had crafted an image of the Westwood family that exuded power, class, and refinement. Naomi, in their eyes, did not fit into that image. The dinner was set at Gloria and Robert's estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and chandeliers that glittered like stars. Ethan insisted Naomi join him, despite her hesitation. Naomi, ever practical, had tried to dissuade him. "Your family isn't ready for someone like me," she had said softly, sitting at his kitchen table the night before. Ethan reached across to take her hand. "They'll have to be," he replied, "because you're not just someone to me. You're everything." Her resolve melted under the warmth of his words, but her nerves didn't disappear. She dressed simply for the occasion, a sleek black dress that highlighted her elegance without feeling ostentatious. Her hair was neatly done, and she wore minimal jewelry. She wanted to show respect, but remained true to herself. Still, as she walked through the grand doors of the Westwood estate, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a lion's den. The dinner started civilly enough. Gloria greeted them with a strained smile, her eyes appraising Naomi in a way that made her feel like she was being judged at every level. Robert offered a polite nod, but said little, letting Gloria take the lead as usual. Ethan's younger sister, Caroline, joined as well, her curiosity thinly veiled behind a veneer of politeness. "So, Naomi," Gloria began as the soup was served, "Ethan tells us you're very involved in community work. That must be fulfilling." Naomi met her gaze, refusing to shrink under the weight of her condescension. "It is. I've always believed that helping others is the best way to create meaningful change." "How noble," Gloria replied, her tone teetering on the edge of dismissive. "And how do you manage that with 5 children? It must be quite the balancing act." Naomi smiled politely. "It is, but my children are my greatest motivation. They remind me every day of why I work so hard." Ethan bristled at his mother's pointed questions, but he held his tongue, knowing Naomi wanted to handle herself. However, as the evening wore on, Gloria's questions grew sharper, more invasive. She began probing into Naomi's past, her late husband, her financial situation, her education, all under the guise of getting to know her better. "Did you ever consider pursuing higher education again?" Gloria asked, her tone dripping with false curiosity. "I imagine it must have been difficult to put those dreams on hold." Naomi stiffened. The question struck a nerve, but she kept her voice steady. "I did consider it," she said, "but sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and you have to prioritize what matters most." "Of course," Gloria said with a tight smile, "though it's a shame. Education can open so many doors." Before Naomi could respond, Ethan cut in, his voice firm. "Naomi doesn't need a degree to prove her worth, Mom. She's accomplished more in her life than most people I know." Gloria's lips thinned, but she didn't back down. Instead, she shifted the conversation to the topic Naomi had feared the most, a prenuptial agreement. "I hope you understand, Naomi. that in our family, certain measures are necessary to protect our legacy, Gloria said, her tone turning icier. A prenuptial agreement is standard practice. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she maintained her composure. Before she could respond, Ethan slammed his hand on the table, startling everyone. That's enough, he said, his voice low but charged with anger. Naomi isn't some opportunist. If you can't see that by now, then you clearly don't know the woman I'm marrying. The tension in the room was palpable. Gloria opened her mouth to argue, but Robert raised a hand to silence her. For the first time that evening, he spoke directly to Naomi. Ethan's right, Robert said quietly. You've clearly worked hard for what you have, and I respect that. But understand this. You're stepping into a world that will scrutinize you at every turn. Are you ready for that? Naomi met his gaze, her voice steady and unwavering. I've faced more scrutiny in my life than most people ever will. If I can survive that, I can survive this. For a moment, Robert simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod, as if conceding a point. Gloria, however, remained visibly displeased, her earlier civility replaced by a cold silence. As they left the estate that night, Ethan turned to Naomi, his frustration evident. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with regret. I never should have brought you into that. Naomi shook her head, her hand finding his. It's okay, she said softly. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also know you're worth it. Her words reassured him, but they also deepened his resolve. He would do whatever it took to protect her, from his family, from society, and from anyone who dared to question her worth. Naomi wasn't one to dwell on the past, but some memories had a way of finding her, no matter how deeply she tried to bury them. The reality of her life was busy. Raising 5 kids didn't leave much room for reflection. Between school pickups, soccer practices, and grocery shopping, she barely had time to think, let alone revisit the parts of her history she worked so hard to leave behind. But the past, stubborn as it was, resurfaced when she least expected it. It was an ordinary afternoon at the grocery store, one of those rare moments when Naomi allowed herself to move slowly, to take her time choosing between brands of cereal. The kids were at school, and for once, she didn't feel like she was racing against the clock. As she reached for a carton of milk, a voice she hadn't heard in years stopped her in her tracks. Well, if it isn't Naomi Johnson, her hand froze midair. She recognized the voice immediately, a mix of syrupy condescension and forced familiarity. Turning slowly, she came face to face with Tanya Simmons, an old neighbor who had once lived down the hall in the cramped apartment complex where Naomi had spent the hardest years of her life. Tanya, Naomi said, forcing a polite smile. It's been a long time. Tanya, dressed in an outfit that screamed, trying too hard, looked Naomi up and down, her gaze lingering just a moment too long on Naomi's modest clothes. I'll say, and look at you now, marrying a millionaire. Huh, who would have thought? Naomi felt her stomach twist. There was no malice in Tanya's words, not outright, but the way she said them felt like a slap. Naomi straightened her back, refusing to let Tanya see how the comment stung. I guess life has a way of surprising you, Naomi replied evenly, hoping to steer the conversation to an end. But Tanya wasn't finished. You know, some of us were really worried about you back then. I mean, after your husband passed. She shook her head theatrically. It's amazing how you managed. And now here you are engaged to someone like Ethan Westwood. Must be nice. Naomi clenched her jaw, struggling to keep her composure. It hasn't been easy, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. But I've always done what I needed to for my kids. Tanya's smile turned sharper, her tone taking on a false air of sympathy. Of course, you always were a fighter, weren't you? I mean, you had to be, especially after giving up all those big dreams. Weren't you going to be a doctor or something? The words hit Naomi like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the mention of her past. It was the way Tanya said it, as if Naomi's sacrifices were something to be pitied, a cautionary tale rather than a testament to her strength. Yes, Naomi said, her voice soft but firm. I was. And then life happened. Tanya opened her mouth to respond, but Naomi didn't give her the chance. She grabbed her cart and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she reached the parking lot, she was trembling, the weight of the encounter crashing down on her. She leaned against her car, taking deep breaths to steady herself. Memories flooded her mind, memories she had worked so hard to push aside. She remembered the day her husband, Marcus, had collapsed at work, the phone call from the hospital that changed everything. They had been so young, with 5 little ones depending on them. Marcus was her rock, the one who had always believed in her dreams, even when she doubted herself. Losing him felt like losing a part of herself. She had been in the middle of her medical residency when it happened. Juggling long hours at the hospital and parenting 5 kids was already a Herculean task, but after Marcus died, it became impossible. She tried to hold on, to push through the grief and exhaustion, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, she made the heartbreaking decision to step away from her career, choosing her children over her ambitions. The years that followed were a blur of sacrifices. She took on whatever job she could find, cleaning houses, working as a cashier, tutoring neighborhood kids, anything to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but she did it. And yet, people like Tanya only saw what she had lost, not what she had built. When Naomi got home that evening, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old photo album she hadn't touched in years. The pictures told a story of a different life. Her and Marcus at their college graduation, her wearing her white coat for the first time, the 2 of them holding their first child. It felt like a lifetime ago. Ethan arrived not long after, his cheerful greeting fading when he saw the look on her face. He sat beside her, his hand covering hers. "Naomi," he said gently. "What's going on?" She hesitated, debating whether to tell him. But as she looked into his eyes, full of concern and love, she realized she didn't want to keep this part of herself hidden any longer. "I ran into someone today," she said finally. "An old neighbor. She brought up some things I hadn't thought about in a long time." Ethan listened as she told him about her past. The dreams she had given up, the sacrifices she had made, the life she had built from the ashes of her loss. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He simply held her hand and let her speak. When she finished, he leaned in, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "Naomi, everything you've been through, it's what makes you who you are. And who you are is extraordinary. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." For the first time that day, Naomi felt a sense of peace. Ethan's words didn't erase the pain of her past, but they reminded her of the strength she had found in herself and the love she had found again in him. Ethan knew winning over Naomi's children wasn't going to happen overnight. Naomi had told him as much when they first started dating, her voice tinged with both pride and apprehension. "They've been through a lot," she had said. "They're protective of me, and I don't blame them for it. If you're serious about this, Ethan, you'll have to prove yourself to them." He had nodded, determined, but the reality of it was much harder than he anticipated. Naomi's 5 kids ranged in age from 6 to 16, and each had their own way of testing him. The youngest, little Mia, was curious but shy, often watching him from behind her mother's leg. The twins, Elijah and Ava, were mischievous and energetic, always finding ways to make him feel like the odd one out. Marcus Jr., the second eldest, was quiet and reserved, keeping his distance from Ethan entirely. But it was Jamal, the eldest, who posed the biggest challenge. At 16, Jamal had taken on the role of protector for the family after his father's death. He was fiercely loyal to his siblings and deeply wary of anyone who might disrupt their fragile sense of stability. Ethan could see it in the way Jamal's eyes narrowed whenever he was around, the way his shoulders tensed at every kind gesture Ethan offered. It was clear Jamal didn't trust him. One Saturday, Ethan arrived at Naomi's house with a box of art supplies for Ava, who had mentioned her love of painting during one of their previous conversations. As he handed it to her, her eyes lit up, but Jamal's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "What's the catch?" he asked, his arms crossed and his expression cold. Ethan turned to him, meeting his gaze calmly. "No catch. Ava told me she loves art, so I thought she might like this." Jamal scoffed. "You think you can just buy us? Bring a couple of gifts and suddenly we'll trust you." "Jamal!" Naomi's voice came from the kitchen, sharp with reprimand. But Ethan raised a hand to stop her. "It's okay," Ethan said. He turned back to Jamal, his voice steady. "I'm not trying to buy anything, Jamal. I know I have to earn your trust, and that's going to take time. I just want to show you that I care." Jamal didn't respond, but his glare softened slightly. It wasn't much, but Ethan took it as a step in the right direction. Over the following weeks, Ethan made a point of being present without being overbearing. He helped Mia with her reading, sitting patiently with her as she stumbled over words. He played catch with Elijah and Ava in the yard, laughing as they tried to outdo each other with their throws. He even managed to get a smile out of Marcus Jr. by asking for help fixing a loose cabinet door, subtly appealing to his quiet, hands-on nature. But Jamal remained distant, his walls firmly in place. One evening, Ethan found Jamal sitting on the porch alone, earbuds in and his expression distant. Ethan hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. Jamal didn't acknowledge him, his focus on the music playing from his phone. Ethan didn't speak right away, letting the silence stretch between them until Jamal finally sighed and pulled out an earbud. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his tone clipped. Ethan looked at him, his voice calm but serious. "I want to understand you." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What's there to understand? You're just another guy trying to act like you belong here." Ethan's chest tightened at the words, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to replace your dad, Jamal. I know how much he meant to you, to all of you. I could never fill that role, and I wouldn't try." Jamal's expression hardened. "Then why are you even here?" "Because I love your mom," Ethan said simply. "And because I care about all of you. I know it's hard to believe, but I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to trust me right now, but I'll keep showing up until you do." Jamal studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he leaned back against the porch railing, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "My dad used to sit out here with me," Jamal said quietly, almost as if to himself. "He'd tell me about his dreams for us, for our family. I promised him I'd take care of everyone, no matter what." Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "And you've done an incredible job, Jamal. Your mom and siblings are lucky to have you, but you don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Jamal didn't argue. He didn't say much else, but when he got up and went inside, he left the door open behind him. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Over time, Ethan's steady presence began to wear down the walls the kids had built around themselves. Little by little, they started to let him in. Mia began running to him for hugs when he arrived, her shy demeanor melting away. Elijah and Ava roped him into their games, treating him like one of the family. Marcus Jr. started asking for his help with small projects, their quiet companionship growing stronger. And Jamal, while still guarded, began to show subtle signs of acceptance, a nod of acknowledgement, a quiet thanks when Ethan helped him with a school project. Ethan knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly becoming part of their lives. And for that, he was willing to wait as long as it took. The gala invitation arrived in an ornate gold embossed envelope, the kind of extravagance Naomi would usually scoff at. It sat on the kitchen counter for days, untouched, while she debated whether to accept Ethan's insistence that she attend. She had no doubt the event would be an ocean of polished, designer-clad elites who saw her as nothing more than an outsider, a curiosity at best, an inconvenience at worst. Ethan brought it up again one evening over dinner, his voice light, but his expression serious. "You haven't RSVP'd yet," he said, motioning to the envelope. Naomi sighed, pushing her fork through the last remnants of her food. I don't think I belong there, Ethan." "You belong wherever you want to be," he replied, leaning closer. "And I want you there, by my side." Naomi glanced at him, her heart warming at the sincerity in his tone. But her doubts lingered. "Your world is so different from mine," she said softly. "I don't have the right clothes, the right connections. I don't even know what I'd say to those people." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You don't need to be anything other than who you are, Naomi. That's why I love you. And if anyone at that gala has a problem with it, they can take it up with me." She smiled despite herself, his confidence infectious. But later that night, as she lay in bed, her worries crept back in. The idea of walking into a room full of people who would judge her every move made her stomach twist. Yet, deep down, she knew Ethan wouldn't have asked her if it wasn't important to him. And if there was one thing Naomi prided herself on, it was her ability to face challenges head-on. The day of the gala arrived, and Naomi found herself standing in front of her closet, staring at the handful of dresses she owned. None of them felt right for an event like this. She was just about to call Ethan and tell him she couldn't go when a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Ethan standing there, a garment bag slung over his arm and a grin on his face. "I figured you might need this," he said, stepping inside. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You bought me a dress? I thought you might appreciate having options," he said with a shrug, hanging the bag on the back of a chair. "But if you don't like it, we'll find something else. Whatever makes you comfortable." Curiosity got the better of her, and she unzipped the bag to reveal a stunning, floor-length gown in a deep emerald green. It was elegant but understated, the perfect balance of sophistication and simplicity. Naomi ran her fingers over the fabric, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, looking up at Ethan. "Thank you." He smiled, his eyes warm. "You're welcome. And for the record, you'd look amazing in anything." When they arrived at the gala that evening, Naomi's nerves were in overdrive. The venue was a sprawling ballroom, its high ceilings adorned with glittering chandeliers and walls lined with opulent decorations. Guests milled about in expensive attire, sipping champagne and exchanging polite, calculated conversations. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the small of her back as they walked in, his presence grounding her. Heads turned as they entered, whispers rippling through the crowd. Naomi felt the weight of their stares, their curiosity and judgment pressing down on her. She fought the urge to shrink into herself, instead standing a little taller, determined not to let them see her discomfort. Ethan introduced her to several people, most of whom greeted her with polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. One woman, a socialite dripping in diamonds, leaned in close and whispered, "So, how did you two meet? It must be such a fascinating story." Naomi's smile didn't falter, though she could feel the condescension dripping from the woman's words. "We met at a community center," she said simply. "Ethan was funding a new library, and I was volunteering there." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "How charitable?" Ethan stepped in smoothly, his tone cool but firm. "It was, and if it weren't for that project, I wouldn't have met the most incredible person I've ever known." The woman blinked, caught off guard, and quickly changed the subject. Naomi shot Ethan a grateful glance, and he gave her a subtle squeeze on the arm. As the evening wore on, Naomi began to relax, though the stares and whispers never fully faded. She focused on Ethan, on the way he navigated the room with ease, always making sure to include her in the conversation. Still, there were moments when the judgment felt suffocating, like when one man asked her if she had adjusted to the lifestyle yet, or when another remarked on how brave Ethan was for dating someone so different. By the time they sat down for dinner, Naomi was emotionally drained. But as she looked across the table at Ethan, who was deep in conversation with a group of investors, she felt a spark of determination. She had survived so much in her life, far worse than the judgment of strangers in fancy clothes. If this was the price of being with the man she loved, she would pay it 100 times over. As the night drew to a close, Ethan pulled her aside, his expression concerned. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay. It's a lot, but I can handle it." He studied her for a moment, then wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You handled it beautifully," he said. "Thank you for being here with me." Naomi smiled, leaning into him. For all the stares and whispers, for all the uncomfortable moments, being with Ethan made it worth it. And as they walked out of the ballroom together, she felt a small flicker of pride. She had faced the night and the judgment with her head held high. Naomi had expected the gala to be difficult, but nothing could have prepared her for the storm she walked into that night. The whispers and sidelong glances began the moment she stepped into the glittering ballroom, and though she tried to ignore them, they stuck to her like a second skin. It wasn't her first experience with judgment, but this felt sharper, colder, like being dissected in public by a room full of strangers who thought they had her all figured out. Ethan stayed by her side, his hand resting lightly on her back as he introduced her to his colleagues, clients, and old friends. He did his best to shield her from the worst of the stares, but there was only so much he could do. Naomi could feel the weight of their unspoken questions, the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Who is she? Why her? How did she land Ethan Westwood? The evening dragged on as Naomi navigated small talk with people who clearly had no interest in her beyond figuring out how she had managed to insert herself into their world. She answered questions about her background as gracefully as she could, choosing her words carefully to avoid giving them more ammunition for their assumptions. But then there was Tanya. Naomi froze when she saw her, an old college classmate she hadn't seen in years, someone who had been there during the brightest and darkest times of her life. Tanya had always been ambitious, calculating, and quick to point out Naomi's flaws. And now, seeing her in this setting, Naomi could tell nothing had changed. Naomi Johnson? Tanya's voice cut through the hum of the room like a knife, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. Her eyes sparkled with thinly veiled malice. I can't believe it. Is it really you? Naomi forced a smile. Tanya, it's been a while. Oh, it has, Tanya said, stepping closer. But wow, look at you now. Engaged to Ethan Westwood, of all people. Who would have thought? The tone of her voice made Naomi's stomach tighten. She could feel eyes turning toward them, people leaning in to catch the exchange. Tanya didn't even try to hide her smirk as she continued. You know, everyone always said you were the smartest in the room back in college, Tanya said, her voice dripping with faux admiration. But I guess life had other plans, huh? What happened to all those big dreams of becoming a doctor? Naomi's chest tightened. She felt the room closing in around her, the curious stares now laced with judgment. Ethan, who had been speaking with a colleague a few steps away, noticed the change in her demeanor and started to move toward her. But Tanya kept going. Don't get me wrong, Tanya said, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. You've obviously done well for yourself, considering, well, everything. 5 kids, right? That's quite the balancing act. And now, a fiancé like Ethan? You're living the dream. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the faces of the guests around her, their expressions a mix of amusement, curiosity, and pity. The humiliation burned deep, but she refused to let it show. Ethan stepped in then, his voice calm but firm. Tanya, it's good to see you, he said, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But I think Naomi's accomplishments speak for themselves, don't you? Tanya blinked, momentarily thrown off by Ethan's directness, but she quickly recovered. Oh, of course, she said with a saccharine smile. I was just reminiscing. Naomi and I go way back. Ethan didn't respond, his focus on Naomi. Are you okay? He asked softly, his concern evident. Naomi nodded, though her throat felt tight. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But the evening wasn't over yet. As the night wore on, more questions came her way, some subtle, others outright cruel. One man, a prominent investor, chuckled as he asked Ethan, so, how does she feel about stepping into this lifestyle? Must be quite the culture shock. Naomi smiled politely, but her hands clenched at her sides. Another guest, a woman dripping in diamonds, leaned in close and whispered, You must be so proud of how far you've come. It's inspiring, really. By the time dinner was served, Naomi was emotionally drained. She excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. As she splashed cold water on her face, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. So out of place, so out of her depth. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and reminded herself why she was there. She loved Ethan, and he loved her. That was what mattered, no matter what anyone else thought. When she returned to the table, Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, his hand finding hers beneath the tablecloth. His touch steadied her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. But the final blow came later in the evening, when Tanya approached her once more, this time with a group of other guests in tow. Naomi, Tanya said, her voice dripping with fake warmth. I was just telling everyone about that time in college when you aced that big anatomy exam. You were so driven back then. What happened? Naomi froze, her composure cracking for the first time that night. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of the judgment bearing down on her. She felt like a spectacle, like an object for these people to gawk at and dissect. Ethan stepped forward, his voice like steel. That's enough, Tanya. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. His expression was calm, but there was no mistaking the anger in his eyes. Naomi has nothing to prove to you or anyone else here, he said. She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I won't stand by while anyone tries to tear her down. The tension was palpable, the silence deafening. Tanya blinked, her confidence wavering for the first time. Ethan turned to Naomi, his hand on her arm. Let's go, he said softly. Naomi nodded, her heart pounding. As they left the ballroom, she felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a simmering anger that she couldn't quite shake. When they reached the car, Ethan turned to her, his voice filled with regret. I'm so sorry, Naomi. I should have. She stopped him with a shake of her head. You don't need to apologize, she said. It's not your fault. But as they drove away, Naomi couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could endure this. She had faced judgment before, but never on this scale. Still, as she looked at Ethan, his jaw tight with determination, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in this fight. And that made all the difference. Naomi sat at the edge of her bed that night, the events of the gala replaying over and over in her mind. The humiliation, the stares, the biting comments, they clung to her like a second skin, refusing to let go. The weight of it was unbearable, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. Ethan was downstairs, pacing the living room. He had been restless since they got home, guilt written all over his face. Naomi had told him she needed a moment to herself, but she knew he was waiting for her to come down, to tell him she was okay. The truth was she wasn't sure she was. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, and she stared at the woman looking back at her. She barely recognized herself. The confident, determined person she had fought so hard to become felt like a distant memory. All she could see now was a woman who didn't belong, a woman who would always be the subject of whispers and judgment in Ethan's world. A soft knock on the door broke her train of thought. Naomi? Ethan's voice was hesitant, as if he were afraid she wouldn't answer. Can I come in? She hesitated, then sighed. Yeah, come in. Ethan stepped into the room, his expression filled with concern. He sat beside her on the bed, his hands resting on his knees as he tried to find the right words. I'm so sorry, he said finally, his voice quiet. For everything that happened tonight. For the way they treated you. I should have. Stop, Naomi interrupted, her voice firmer than she expected. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. This isn't your fault, Ethan. You didn't say those things. You didn't stare at me like I didn't belong. But I brought you into that world, he countered. I should have known they'd act like this. I should have done more to protect you. Naomi's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. You can't protect me from this, she said softly. This is how they'll always see me. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I'll always be the outsider. The woman who doesn't deserve to be there. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. That's not true. You do belong, Naomi. You belong with me, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth your time. She wanted to believe him, but the doubts were too loud, the echoes of the night still fresh in her mind. She pulled her hand away, standing and walking to the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. I've been fighting my whole life, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Fighting to prove that I'm more than my circumstances. More than a widow. More than a single mother. But no matter how hard I try, people like Tanya will always see me as less. And I don't know if I have the strength to keep fighting. Ethan stood, crossing the room to stand beside her. He didn't speak right away, letting her words hang in the air. When he finally did, his voice was steady, full of conviction. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said. Not to Tanya, not to my family, not to anyone in that room tonight. You're enough, Naomi. More than enough. And if they can't see that, it's their loss. She turned to him, her eyes filling with tears. I want to believe that, she said, her voice breaking. But it's so hard, Ethan. It's so damn hard. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. I know it is, he said, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, Naomi, for every stare, every comment, every moment of doubt. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. His words broke through the wall she had built around herself, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his chest. He held her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head as she let out all the pain she had been holding in. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let someone else carry the weight with her. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her face with the sleeve of her shirt. I don't want to feel like this, she said quietly. I don't want to let them win. Ethan smiled softly, his hands still resting on her shoulders. Then don't. You're stronger than they'll ever know, Naomi. You've faced so much already, and you've come out the other side every time. This is just another challenge, and I know you can overcome it. She looked at him, the warmth in his eyes melting away the last of her doubts. You really believe that? With everything I have, he said without hesitation. Naomi took a deep breath, a spark of determination reigniting within her. She thought of her children, of the life she had fought so hard to build for them. She thought of the love she had found with Ethan, the way he saw her not as someone to fix, but as someone to cherish. And she thought of the people who had doubted her, who had tried to tear her down. They wouldn't win. She wouldn't let them. Okay, she said finally, her voice stronger. I'm not giving up. Not on myself and not on us. Ethan smiled, pulling her into another embrace. That's my girl. As she stood in his arms, Naomi felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready to face it. With Ethan by her side, she knew she could. The follow-up charity event was nothing like the gala Naomi had endured just weeks prior. This time, Ethan had been invited as a keynote speaker, an honor recognizing his contributions to community outreach and philanthropy. Despite Naomi's initial hesitation, Ethan convinced her to attend. You need to come, he had said earnestly the night before. Not for them, but for yourself. You've earned your place in this world, Naomi, whether they see it or not. She had agreed, though not without some trepidation. The wounds from the gala still felt fresh, but she refused to let the cruelty of others define her. With a renewed sense of purpose, she put on the emerald dress Ethan had given her, the one she hadn't been able to fully appreciate before, and walked into the event with her head held high. The venue was buzzing with energy. Unlike the glittering ballroom of the previous event, this space had a more subdued elegance, its decor emphasizing the causes being highlighted that evening: education and healthcare accessibility. Ethan and Naomi made their way through the crowd, stopping occasionally as he introduced her to colleagues and acquaintances. The whispers and judgment she had once felt were still there, but this time, Naomi didn't let them faze her. As the evening progressed, a speaker took the stage to share the story of how the fundraiser's efforts had impacted local communities. The room quieted, the crowd's attention drawn to the story of a young woman who had received a scholarship to medical school through one of the programs. Her tale of perseverance and triumph struck a chord with Naomi, who found herself unexpectedly emotional. Memories of her own dreams, the ones she had buried long ago, resurfaced, tugging at her heart. When the speaker finished, the applause was loud and genuine. Ethan leaned over, whispering, "You okay?" Naomi nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "I'm fine. Just thinking." The evening moved on to its final segment, a recognition ceremony for key contributors to the fundraiser's success. Naomi watched with pride as Ethan was called to the stage. His name met with a round of applause. He spoke with his usual charisma, sharing anecdotes about the work they'd done and the lives they'd touched. But as his speech came to an end, he did something unexpected. "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special," Ethan said, his voice steady as he scanned the crowd. His eyes landed on Naomi, and he smiled warmly. "Naomi, would you mind joining me up here?" Naomi froze, her heart racing. The room turned to look at her, murmurs spreading like wildfire. She felt every nerve in her body screaming to stay in her seat, but Ethan's steady gaze calmed her. Slowly, she stood, making her way to the stage as all eyes followed her. When she reached him, Ethan took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Many of you already know about Naomi, he began, but what you might not know is just how extraordinary she truly is. Naomi's cheeks burned, but Ethan didn't stop. He spoke about her work at the community center, her dedication to her children, and the quiet strength she carried through every hardship. But then, he did something she didn't expect. I'll let her tell you the rest, Ethan said, turning to her. Because her story deserves to be heard, Naomi stared at him, her throat dry. She wanted to protest, to step back into the safety of anonymity, but something in Ethan's expression gave her courage. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face the audience. I'm not sure what Ethan expects me to say, she began, her voice trembling slightly, but I suppose I'll start with this. I never planned to be standing here. My life hasn't followed the path I imagined for myself. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Naomi's voice grew steadier as she spoke, finding strength in the vulnerability of the moment. I was once a medical student, she continued. I had dreams of becoming a doctor, of helping people in ways that mattered. But life has a way of throwing you curveballs. My husband, Marcus, passed away suddenly, leaving me with 5 children to raise on my own. I had to make a choice, one I never imagined I'd face. I chose my family. I chose to put my dreams aside so my kids could have a chance at theirs. The murmurs in the room quieted entirely. Naomi glanced at Ethan, who gave her an encouraging nod, and she pressed on. It wasn't easy, she admitted. There were nights I went to bed wondering if I was doing enough, if I was enough. I worked jobs that didn't require a degree, but demanded everything I had to give. And for a long time, I thought that part of my life, the ambitious, driven part of me, was gone. Her voice softened as she looked out at the crowd. But then I met Ethan. He reminded me that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. He showed me that the sacrifices I made didn't diminish my worth.
If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.